Hey everyone, before I begin playing the interview, I just wanted to say this was an amazing opportunity. Reading the books Adultism and Dragon Mother by Michael Tsarion were incredibly eye opening and also confirming in a lot of ways as a woman what is going on in the female psyche. I had questions I wanted to ask Michael, and instead of just emailing him with those questions, I thought, why not invite him on for an interview so that he can elaborate on these, on the topic of female psychology and the questions that I had in such a way where I'm hoping you will benefit as well from the information that is shared. I feel like this interview was the answers that he provided. I feel like it was a great supplement to the books. Certainly, though, highly recommend you read the books because they go very deep into what's going on in female psychology, especially parts of the female psychology that are hard to admit exist, but yet are so important to acknowledge for forward-moving evolution in a way that is healthy and productive, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. And so, without further ado, here comes the interview. I hope you enjoy. All right, so let's start. Hey, everybody, Sarah D. Haven. Pretty awesome opportunity today. I am interviewing Michael Tsarion, and he's the author of many books, researcher and scholar, definitely has an important perspective on the human psyche that I feel is a huge contribution to our progression work as far as evolution is concerned. The two books that we're going to be focusing on today, or at least kind of the spirit of these books, I guess we could say, diving into that, is Dragon Mother, huge, impactful book. Dragon Mother, A New Look at the Female Psyche, groundbreaking work, and Adultism, The Reign of the Terrible Mother. First off, Dragon Mother, the title of this book, I'm kind of wanting to define terms for people who may not be familiar with such terms. Could you define what a dragon mother is, and is it necessarily an entirely negative thing?
No. As a matter of fact, it's a positive thing, actually. And I'm glad that you opened with that, because the dragon mother is just, it's an old concept, right? And you can find it in mythology to a degree, right? But as you move into the psychological world, then it's really people like Carl Jung, Erich Neumann, who's really the book is dedicated to. It's his work that's largely behind Dragon Mother, as well as a host of other female psychologists, I might add. Yeah, so, and I'm just maybe embellishing it a little bit, expanding it, but I think along very consistent lines. And you do see in sand paintings of the ancient, and these in the natives, and in China, you do have this motif, even in alchemy, actually, of the encircling serpent. But since the hieroglyphic for woman was the serpent, the hierogram, then, okay, it's all very clear. And it was clear to Erich Neumann. These people made no bones about it, that encircling serpentine, cackler or hack, there's all sorts of Anglo-Saxon words for the serpent, and it was always connected to the woman. Both the sound of the serpent, and that would be not only the hiss, the more obvious hissing sound, but the rattlesnake rattling, right? This comes down. Aboriginal sounds that they make with their voices, especially during ritual times. The neophyte, usually a male, was always, come of age, say 21, he's thrown into that circle with the rattlers. And so this was fairly, just like the sun was a way for a man to replicate the wounds of his mother and the wounds of the female in terms of the goddess. So there's nothing new there, right? It has to be, it's good though that it's distinguished from the terrible mother, which is another term. I didn't invent it. That's a term from psychology. And so those have to be distinguished right off, that any and all mothers are dragon mothers, but, a few are the terrible mother. And that's just a fascinating subject. But you're quite right. All mothers are the dragon mother because they encircle the ego germ. they provide the physical womb, but they also provide the mental space. And I think even probably on a more important level is that when a child is born, that child is really a blank slate in sort of the top meaning of that term. It's such a problematic term, but if there is such a thing as a blank slate, then it's the newborn infant. And so through human projection, the mother becomes the container, right? Just like this, the enclosing circle again, there's a sort of enclosure idea, but one can style it as a container. One can style it as a mirror, actually. It works really well as a metaphor. And so the young child's blankness is a very temporary moment in which there's an orientation taking place. And people like Newman, were cleverly said that it's almost as if for a moment there's a projection of the child's identity onto the mother, who then mirrors it back at a given point. And therefore, from that moment on, the child does not have a pure identity, couldn't possibly. It has to be commingled with that identity of its mother. So this is why cord breaking later on is difficult. There's difficulties arise from this, of course, but really there's nothing can be done about it. Nature has ordained that, So, and what I'm trying to say is that the mother is then the keeper of the identity of the child. Her terrible mother begins, the goodly mother, the dragon mother will always preserve it, very, religiously is not the right word I'm looking for, with care, with immense reverence, because it's the identity of a person. But the terrible mother's going, no, there's no person involved here. This is my son or daughter. I'll do what I like. Not explicitly, perhaps, but, that kind of mentality is there. I'm sure a lot of people can testify to that. And so then you enter into more problems. So the terrible mother, will be somebody who sort of more covetously, more carelessly, perhaps even in a more of a selfish and sinister way, take and then reproject back. So a lot of our identity is actually a reprojection. So there's all these areas that hasn't been gone into by people. And I was just fascinated by that, and then coming out of the world of Erich Newman and others, it just seemed right to me then to, work on that. But outside of the controversial aspects of the thesis, it's just interesting. To me, it's if this was the male psyche, it would just be as interesting. If it was the female psyche, I approach it very, very, without bias and with a tremendous intellectual interest. But as you're quite right, unfortunately, because of our society and various other things, it has become somewhat taboo to talk about these matters. But to me, it's just carrying on the normal psychological studies of a host of different people, many of them women.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. It certainly is a taboo topic in this society. It seems to me that to imply that women could have psychological issues outside of being caused by men is completely impossible. That seems to be a narrative that I have observed, at least personally, in my experience as a person, just observing the world. And from what I understand, at least from my own studies and also reading your book, Atlantis helped contribute to this to some extent as well. So it seems like there was like an original wound that may have contributed to how the psyche of women has been, we could say, distorted. And over time, we can see that this is, at least from what I can tell, it seems as though this has been perpetuated and propagated generation upon generation upon generation up until this point, where now we are dealing with, we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner and it needs to be dealt with. I'm just curious if you could maybe, I know it's such a wide and vast topic, so I don't necessarily expect you to go into more detail than you prefer, but could you maybe describe to us a bit about what the root cause is as far as the damage to the female psyche, as far as your understanding is?
There's many, many ways of coming at that, and it crosses a vast expanse. Because remember, it's both ontogenetic and phylogenetic. If you take phylogenetic, then you're talking about almost certainly before the Bronze Age. You could even go back into the Paleolithic. This is how incredible the subject is. If you're dealing with ontogenic, well, it's just mom and dad. scarring the girl, scarring a young baby girl, you can take it. So there's already two very connected, but at the same time, very diverse ways of coming at it. One is the historian and the anthropologist, and the other is the psychologist and the pediatrician. So my goodness, already there you've got, but you're quite right to mention a very fundamental, to mention a fundamental, and that is trauma. Because it's not just women who were traumatized by, the terrestrial cataclysms in the past. It was both sexes, right? And that's put them at loggerheads right there. Men are very responsible for the way women turn out and the way they are. It's just that they shouldn't be responsible to the point where the women have then gone to the extent of, creating whole feminist movements and stuff like that. But men stand indicted. Men have ruined our world. There's no question about that. So, it's just to what lengths you'll go with your proposed fixes of that. Nothing that the feminists doing are fixing anything for men or women, right? But my God, a critique of the male world, absolutely that stands. And then it all goes back to this original trauma, and the scar really is the onslaught of what we know as evil. It's not just a scar, it's something that has riven us. And the Bible's texts are one sort of telling of that, not a particularly good one, because you can go back to Babylon, Samaria, Acadia and get better ones. You can even go to Celtic Ireland and get better, explanations really. But at least it is one valid explanation, though they throw in all these sorts of characters like trees of life and serpents and all the rest of it. But buried in that story is a lot of truth as well. So that we are scarred. And you can't think of anything. Forget about the mother-child relationship or the parent-child relationship. Every aspect of social life, probably even the reason for getting into tribes in the first place, let alone what happens, after that point, is based on a trauma that took place. This is, what launched my work off and made it very different than everybody else. And even those who are speaking about trauma, there have been some scholars, people have talked about trauma like Julian Jaynes, but really, it wasn't adequate. The closest I would recommend is somebody like Immanuel Velikovsky. And yet, as great as his work of it is, there's still a little bit missing there. I think he meant to do more, but he passed away. So I look at myself as being in their tradition. And that's in the first chapters and introduction of Dragon Mother. You'll read their names. So the scar that caused any kind of ill, any kind of malefaction, all the way up to evil, is ancient. And it happened partly through cataclysm, physical terrestrial cataclysm that traumatized people. And, then I take up the story from there. And although there's been some healing, that healing has only been on certain levels, meaning that despite some progress and despite some healing, humanity on a certain fundamental level is still pretty affected by the trauma that happened. And that comes out in our emotional connection. And one has to then train themselves to see other areas in which it comes out, like world crime, all sorts of horrendous class divisions, and just basically the whole catalog of the criminal history of mankind and humankind is a testament. I link it back to that. And I rest on the shoulders of giants in doing that. Of course, I've taken their work further. But what is most irritating or is most horrific to think about is that because there is this weird soil through the laws of resonance, this can often be hard for people to get, but it's quite consistent. And that is through the law of resonance, any trauma that you or I might experience at any given time in our life doesn't just reverberate on its own ontogenetically. Any trauma awakens the sleeping monster of the trauma below in the deep unconscious. So now we have a dynamic that you have to be into psychology in order to understand. The pediatrician and most human beings, including parents, if there's trauma that's happened to them in their life, or they're committing trauma to somebody else, it's just a purely physical, just physical, domestic, social, political. We've got to move on from that. The whole human race has. No. Any trauma, no matter how small and insignificant, has the potential, if it's repeated, like say child abuse is repeated, or there's so many other examples, but just in general, any trauma that seems to be repeated, like a trauma of people, like I grew up in Belfast, right? So everybody was traumatized there, walking around smiling or whatever, but they're deeply traumatized. That trauma awakens a deeper laid trauma in the psyche, in terms of a collective psyche. And that is not healthy. That can arrest progress. It can completely double or triple dose the trauma that the person is feeling, and they don't know why, So something that was maybe a tiny little minor trauma that happened to them, they were beat up, or they were paramilitaries, came and beat them up or did something horrible. But then this person can't get over it. And for years and years later, they're insomniacs, their blood pressure skyrocketing, you get my point, that something that really should have died away within a couple of days doesn't. And there's thousands of examples of this. There's experts now I can even name that know that somebody who's a little whiplash, a little car thing, a bumper scrape or whatever they call it, and suddenly they're into 6 years of therapy. They call it whiplash. The doctors, the osteopaths go, there's absolutely nothing wrong with your spine, but you're coming down with all these symptoms, you see?
Yeah.
So you can take it from there. I believe it's because this is being dredged up from underneath. And it's quite a study, actually. But, I try to hone it down to the parent-child relationship in these latter books. Earlier, I took it on in the Velikovskian way, in a much broader swathe. But now I still do the same thing. I'm still studying the same phenomena, but in a slightly different context, in the mother-child relationship.
Yes, and it seems so fundamental, really, when you think about the concept of like the very origins of the universe and humanity, the concept of the cosmic womb. This is the space that we come from, and from what you're saying, it's just got me thinking about the origins of evil, and I sometimes I wonder, was humanity always as twisted as it was? In my root now, this is just my own feeling, but I don't think it was anywhere near what it's become. It's interesting because you mentioned in the book, and this may be your term or someone else's term, but the dragon fight, and this concept of what you're speaking with regard to trauma. I mean, to become who it is we are, the traumas need to be released in order to be able to stand in the full coding of who it is we are. And it seems like a big piece of that process, unfortunately, and yet, through cause and effect, this is where we're at. We need to kind of battle the program that we received from our own mother's trauma, from their own belief systems, if they're not resonating or aligned to who it is that we're here to be or that we want to be. And yes, please, yes, go ahead.
Well, we never do. And even those who try to do it badly or give up because it's in the dark. It's something you're fighting in the dark. The dark in this instance means the semiotic level. See, Freud and everybody were brilliant people, but they shunted it forward 2 years. They shunted the mother relationship 2 years ahead, where the Oedipal complex starts. And on a very good day, they might say, okay, we'll take it back to 1 year old. 1 year old? What are you talking about? There's 9 months in the womb and a short period afterwards. That's like 900 years to a child. It's not even in time. And it took a leading feminist, Julia Kristeva, to actually, these really good stuff as well as negative stuff. And one of the positive things was, hey, you're starting way too late. What about that? What about that embryonic? In uterine, they call it, right? The situation in the womb. I mean, doesn't that mean anything? And, and sadly for Freud and people like that, it didn't. Otto Rank is the one, his secretary went on to write a book called The Trauma of Birth. Okay, we finally started. How long ago was that? Like the 1940s or something like that? We are not very far ahead. And then after his book, basically it's been dropped again or so misconstrued. And then of course there is a lot of other areas of psychology to focus on. We all know that. Oedipal situation, puberty, all of that. So this little period, the semiotic, which is the real darkness where a lot of things happen to the psyche, has been forgotten. But the trouble is that phylogenetic, ontogenetic issue comes in again because there's parallels. It's not just in the womb that some sort of historical replication is being done, to the fetus on a biological level. In the semiotic level, there's a world, there's an entire zeitgeist. Right, the story of humankind is being written implicitly in the psyche of the. We're not even talking newborn. We're talking literally, still fetus. Yeah. So this is, and they know this now. They've finally got the what do you call it? The equipment. These pediatricians and whatever else they're called. These characters of now I can see, on these extraordinary instruments and telescopes, all sorts of neuronal stuff running around. showing that there's unbelievable activity. I mentioned that in chapter 3 of the book. We'll go into a lot of that, but they're discovering new things every day. You couldn't keep up on it. So yeah, but what they haven't discovered yet is the trauma aspect. They're still miles behind.
Yeah, it's very strange to me that the traumas and root causes don't seem to be addressed so much in conventional science. And that's not just even psychologically, but even with regard to, how the state of the planet, the state of the economy, all of these kinds of things, even the housing markets, there's not a lot of looking at the roots and understanding the root causes. And of course, if you don't understand root causes, there's not a lot of effective solutions that can be created. I mean, it's sort of a crapshoot whether or not the solution is actually going to work when we're operating from that space. Interestingly enough, this has me thinking about logos. In astrology, this is, I just want to throw this in there because I thought you might be interested in this since you are also, you also study astrology. I look at the asteroids and other bodies that haven't quite been classified yet, and it's very interesting that there has been a body that is past Neptune. It's between Neptune and Pluto that has been named Logos. And
okay.
Yeah, and it has a 19-year orbit as far as I'm concerned. It's very slow, but it actually, I think it's like 19 years per sign, actually. So the whole trip around the zodiac is quite slow. And I've been studying this one at length, and it seems to me that it is a bridge between Pluto and Neptune as far as tapping into cosmic intelligence, cosmic rational thinking, like thinking on a higher level of logic that is, outside of man-made laws and opinions. And so in your book, you speak quite a lot and elaborate quite a lot on logos from a psychological perspective. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit about why you think it's so vital to self-actualization and individuation.
It's key to it because, again, all right, let's take it. There's so many ways to take that, but imagine that without the trauma that happened, that has definitely obstructed evolution. Imagine that didn't happen, right? Then you'd have progress. So there's in everything, there's always a contrarium, as I call it, this polarity. And you just surely as hell don't have to be a genius to see it. It's everywhere. Masculine, feminine being probably one of the classic iterations, but even sleep and waking, breathing in and out. So there's progress in a way that would have been just healthy. And it's not that progress never reached obstruction, but the trauma that we're talking about was colossal, right? And so what do you make of progress then? It's almost like regress. And a study of the semiotic level and the mother-parent relationship keeps showing that regress. So something that happened was so severe that the human progress, which is logos, which is the progress, right? Because it means understanding, but it also implies logic. And logic in the true Germanic way wasn't anything to do with the way the word has been construed now. Logic is nothing but, an A following to a B, to a C, to a D, a process, not necessarily put in by consciousness, but something that's there at the deepest level of reality. Reality itself is logos. Mm-hmm. Spirit is logos, right? And its movement is totally unique, right? And everything that then emerges, human life, human consciousness, God and ideas about God, they're all subject to logos. Logos is first. God is not first. Right? God is a phenomenon that arises again, is so unique. The vision of it, the vision of it is quite immense. And so that movement is what throws up weird plants, weird artifacts. We're one of those artifacts. So the great philosophers, right, thought of it as the logos as a progressive thing, also called spirit, but also called mind, actually. And that's a very good thing, because then it allows even materialists to, pay attention to what's being said, because you don't have to actually construe it as anything metaphysical, actually, because in German, the word for spirit is also the word for mind. And this is a very embracing, that's why they get rid of it. All German thought, had to be crushed, including a lot of the psychology we're talking about, right? The Freuds, the Ranks, the Wilhelm Reiches, that's a whole other conversation about America's role and Britain's role in destroying all kinds of Germanic thought for the very reasons we're going into right now, of what it reveals. So logos is just progress. Now, ultimately speaking, logos is not going to be permanently inhibited because it's not human. It's not of us only. We actually participate in it. We're essential to the process, but the process of logos, right, cannot be reduced to a human mind. Of course it couldn't. Look around you, right? There's nothing but regress. But it still moves in its own mysterious, august way. And then it had obstructions. So in one simple, 101 level, the trauma was one of many obstructions, except this one was colossal, right? And so we do have to work it out. And we have psychology now since 1930, and that's why it is so disheartening to see how little people are into it, especially women, right? They have no interest in it at all for the most part. And this is crucial. And it is part of society. It's been made complicated. It's made very intellectualized and all the rest of it. There's so many things that can be said about it. But nevertheless, despite those disclaimers, there's going to be no progress until people get, into psychology, especially child psychology. I mean, this was Wilhelm Reich's point. This was Jung, Karen Horney, you name it. My goodness, Alice Miller. They've said it. I'm just reiterating it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, psychology. I mean, if we think about yin and yang, obviously the yin is a lot more complex, right, than yang. As far as psychology is concerned, the subconscious, like the unconscious, these kinds of things. And as a woman myself, I have to say, when you're paying attention to what's going on inside, it's really hard to look at, to admit certain things. Most women want to, at least from, this is just my opinion, but like it seems like a lot of women would prefer that they're pretty, like, my good angle is shown. It's not so much that people want to admit that they're the evil witch, that they're the colonizer, that they are the child killer, that they are, the gold digger. Like, there's not a lot of admitting to that, let alone root causal factors, or like what's the motivating factor with regard to that. I feel like part of why women don't want to study these types of things is because there's an assumption tied to it, and it has a lot to do with, I feel like, the sign of Virgo in a sense, where there's this sadomasochism that occurs, and this feeling of inferiority. And yet at the same time, progress can't be made until we get context into that, because the inferiority feeling, at least from my observations, is just one strata that, we still need to go deeper into that to understand like what's really going on there. I'm curious if you study the north and south node of the moon, correct?
It's not part of my system, but I'm aware of it in a general sense. Yeah, about the south is the past programming and tendencies, and the north would be, your freedom to the logos, right? To go into new fields. Mm-hmm. And also the heroism that will drive you there, a certain level of desire to explore, new potentials. That's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's aligned with what my understanding of it is as well. In evolutionary astrology, which is a school of astrology that I'm very focused on, it actually looks at the planetary nodes of all the planets except the sun, because the sun doesn't have nodes. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because Pluto actually has a very significant north and south node transit that's been lasting. It's over 1,000 years, and the south node is in Capricorn, right now hitting and dancing with where Pluto was during the Declaration of Independence signing. And I have a point with this, I swear. And the north node of Pluto is in Cancer, which is very interesting to me because in at least evolutionary astrology's perspective, Cancer and Capricorn are the axis of gender, mother and father. And, we hear all this stuff about patriarchy, and people want to blame the past, say patriarchy is the root of the problem. Yet Capricorn is a yin sign. It's a feminine sign. And it's interesting because part of that south node of Pluto, the soul development, I see Pluto as kind of like soul evolution. Our evolution on that level through desire and need for power, and to shed that power and to be very real about what's going on in the shadow. Having our south node in Capricorn, especially with where we're at this point in time in human consciousness, where we're coming up on the Pluto return for the United States in 2022, it seems as though, it's a pretty big one. It seems as though on a soul level, we are at the end of a cycle now, about to begin a new cycle where there's a lot of admitting that needs to happen. Like, for instance, what's going on in the female psychology. And I feel like this may be why the timing of your book is both of your books are so poignant, because it's aligned very much to this Pluto return, where we kind of need to look. Well, my connection looks like it's dropping a bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Where we need to look at all sides of what got us here as a species, as far as our society is concerned, as far as where we're at as humans, individuals, and what we do next. And like I was saying, it seems like studying our own psychology is a big piece of that, like the feminine and the masculine in all of us, regardless of gender. So where I wanted to go next with this was, you mentioned the solar and lunar worlds in your book, which I found very interesting. How some people can be trapped in the lunar world, never to be able to embark into the solar world, or piggybacking on, perhaps this is my own terminology, but kind of almost like piggybacking on others to get into the solar world, but never quite breaching it. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about the solar and lunar worlds so that we can understand it a bit better.
Well, what you were saying there, first of all, is very, very interesting. I think we should talk more about that. Maybe even have you as a guest on, because that is most interesting. That is actually very, very fascinating. I do also see Capricorn on a symbolic level as feminine, because it represents Terra, it's the earth. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think a masculine reading of that on the whole is a little wrong. So you're quite, that rings to me very much. And the Cancer thing, my goodness. America itself is born under Cancer. So what you're saying really rings true to me. We should definitely take that up at a future point. Yeah, the lunar solar thing was Erich Newman's discovery, really. I didn't invent that. It made a lot of sense to me, and he actually has more stages. Being German, he must have, they really do categorize and subcategorize, right? And I just said, what the hell is this? So I just took out like 2 or 3 of like a 5-stage thing that he had, and said, look, people can read that. But I just wanted to give a sort of a thumbnail sketch of this ascent, the unconscious, right? There's like at least 3 to 4 stages just from the unconscious to the conscious. And then there's, 2 or 3, maybe up to the self-conscious. So I just made it clear, just made it simpler to say that, you maybe have the lunar, and the pre-solar, and then the solar. But Erich Newman, breaks it down into things like phallic solar, and all of this. I can't remember all the categories now. But, I just got to the heart of what he was saying. And that is, as you rightly point out, it's this ascent, right? Ultimately, it's just euphemisms. They're not really that accurate, but they work well, as euphemisms, that from the solar semiotic realm of unconsciousness, in which there is a seed of desire to move up. So this, although it be lunar, and although a soul can be arrested, right? Like Mordred is arrested by Morgana, he never moves on. He becomes chivalric. He becomes a big brawny knight of the Round Table, but his mind and heart is totally colonized by the witch, right? Mm-hmm. So you can remain on that semiotic level, as most of the men in the world today are. Don't get fooled just because they all look, like Arnold Schwarzenegger or some sort of chivalric typology, right? We'll maybe get to that down the line. That can be very much deceiving people. But then there is also the Bonhoeffer, enter it as the masculinized woman, which is a very healthy mode typology, and men enter it as the masculine male mode, right? And so that's the healthy. You have to have the healthy part of the barometer or thermometer to know, to have the antipodes to know where the malignant is, right? And actually, we all move quite, fluidly between those, right? There's times when even the strongest masculine type, both male and female, will hit, a place in which it's the dark night of the soul. Kierkegaard, some of the greatest minds we know have gone through it. And in fact, some of the greatest literature ever is written on it. Your Cervantes or whatever it may be. You'll write about this. Every author of their merit has talked about the dark night of the soul. So just being in the solar world doesn't mean you're going around watching, world wrestling all day long or something, and being all solar. But it is reality as it would be in front of you in its most vivid, right? And it's the world of the real that we know, mm-hmm. without all the shadows and all the psychic obstruction, right? And so that's basically it in general, just to make the point that there is a progress from this unconscious realm, which is dominated by the spirit of the dragon mother, or the terrible mother, if you're unlucky. And then there's a seed within the lunar type. Every child has within it the seed of progress. So there's that conflict again between, oh, this is nice, I want to stay here. And part of us reaches out, you get this metaphor in the original Frankenstein movie with Boris Karloff. They have this incredible scene where the monster is reaching for the light. It's one of the most unique images in film history. And if you could just decode the film into what it really is about, it's all about what we're talking about. So that desire to reach up for the light is purely ontological, purely natural, organic, and all the rest of it, right? And the terrible mother is then one who sort of prevents it. This Morgana-like figure, a Medusan sort of figure, who's threatened by her child's move toward independence, individuation, and progress. And that's bad enough in an individual woman, mother. The question that the book sort of raises is inevitably what would happen if that then became the way a whole culture was, so feminized and ultra feminized actually, that on a wholesale level, the progress of all masculine types, masculine women, masculine men, was arrested. And see, that's my analysis of the 20th century. And that's why, it's like a doomsday situation, actually.
It's interesting you say that, because that's, if you look at where things are going right now, yes, we can look at the astrology and see Pluto's going into Aquarius in the not too distant future in some years. Uranus will be moving into Gemini. There's a lot of air sign stuff, Saturn and Jupiter moving into Aquarius in the not too distant future. It has a lot to do with androgyny, but I think that it's also been purposefully obfuscated, this concept, because of course we want to be balanced in our masculine and feminine on an individual level, where we're empowered in that, we're true to ourselves. But what I'm seeing in the psyche of the masses is a distortion of this concept, where there's a distortion of the feminine and the masculine, to the point where the feminine is just swallowing up society and the psyche of the masses, to the point where it's kind of like what you're saying, where it seems like a lot of people seem to be trapped in the lunar world, not really seeing clearly reality, or even their own mind, their own actions, the causes of why they choose to act in certain ways. And then the the terrible mother concept, of whether you're a man or a woman, I'm kind of seeing this being placed on top of others, where it's forcing people to conform to certain societal standards, or demographical standards, depending on what the crowd feels is right behavior. One example, now controversial opinion, but one example is I'm multiracial. So I have heard this in my quest to kind of know myself, through people who tell me that, oh, don't worry, you're not white, so you can't be racist. Racism is only for white people. And they've taken the word and they've redefined the base word of racism, and taken it to mean something more akin to systemic racism. And so, like, my point with this is that we're even seeing words being redefined, being changed, and even the concept of morality and ethics is being perverted to suit people's delicate sensibilities, which I would assume are symptoms of being stuck in the lunar world rather than stepping into their own. How do you feel about what I'm saying, or do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
In fact, just before we come online to talk, a guy sent me an email of a whole bunch of words that have been recently removed from the lexicon. Mm-hmm. That means dictionaries and just, taboo. So you're quite right. And yeah, it's part of the ultra feminization, because only a very, see, when I spoke of the trauma, now we're getting into more of what that means. The effects of trauma destabilizes identity. And then the dragon fight that you mentioned also further then on an ontogenetic level, right, in the life of an individual, further weakens identity and will. So you're left with a sort of a jelly, right? And because you've learned to accommodate school and kick a ball around, or, wear a leather jacket, or, act like the big jock, and girls have their own ways of doing it, just because you've become acculturated doesn't mean that on a psychological level, your core is anything more than a marshmallow. And so, as I said, you take a message, you take a gauge of that on the national level, the cultural level, and you find that this is the case. And so that kind of weakling individual who's not only dissociated from his body, and his feelings and his mood, but is thoroughly schizoid because he hates himself, right? Because the result of the dragon fight is to actually hate yourself. It's an elaborate process of talk about in the Dragon Mother articles. There's free articles on that website for people who are interested in this. But the sum result of this movement is autophobia. And so the autophobe, the self-hater, goes into society, meets with loads and loads of other self-haters, and they all become so hair trigger-like, because there's no wriggle room, right? They're overwhelmed with anxiety. Now, this is the trick because there's actually positive anxiety, but we're not going to talk about that. That's getting into existential psychology. There's a thing called legitimate anxiety, right? But just let's keep it with the raw, brute form of just anxiety, So these people are so absolutely drenched in anxiety, especially the neurotic kind of anxiety, that there's no sanity, there's no wriggle room. I mean, they're right up to the brim. And so don't you see then that if some external affront, like some male and pale guy with a little bit of racism, a little bit of bias, or whatever it might be, it might not even be that. It could, like as you're saying, just be some word. Or in fact, it's even more sometimes obscure. It's not me denying that there are, assholes out there with racist or biased beliefs. There are. But you shouldn't be, used to be in the old world, you just, you did what you did with them and that was it. Now, even things that are just imperceptible are triggering the head, to probe it and discover its etiology and do some forensic, psychology and discover, oh my God, these people are already so prickly within, right? The knives and the daggers that they've already stabbed into their own heart. They're gasping for breath. They're not in the real. And therefore, they have to, number one, project outward, the classic projection where everybody's, like Jung and Freud said, you project out, you transfer in a psychotic way, and therefore make everybody else to blame for anything that's wrong with you, right? Maximize now, because of the crowd, like you said, that amplifies those neurotic and even psychotic tendencies. We just did on Unslaved a program just this week, just this last Sunday, called Mass Hysteria 2020, went into it. And so this is what you get on an individual paranoiac. If you know a lot about pathology and you meet certain types, one type can be paranoiac, and that is no matter how much you give to them or care or reassurance, they always think it's you're stabbing in the back, and talking to their enemies and poisoning them and meaning well for them and thinking evil about them. And so that's now on the national level. So the 101 of this is that all the things we're talking about and all the things that you're seeing in the world today are actually based on some very, very basic principles of 101 psychology. So that's a help to people who are listening to this and a bit overwhelmed. Don't be. None of what we're talking about is really that difficult. These are pretty standard issues, right? And they're just modifications or they're elaborations on some very basic stuff. What we're seeing, it's not really that uncurable, and it's certainly not ununderstandable, right? It's all stuff that you'll see in a private world. It's the bully boy tactics of the schoolyard and so on. It's the evil authoritarian master at the front of the class, or the bully boy, as I said, gone sort of ballistic. And so just a little bit of psychological reorienting and brushing up on things is all I ever ask for. I don't ask anyone to have degrees in psychology or neuroscience or anything like that. A lot of this stuff is really just basic, but we're losing it, as you say. It's sort of fading away. But then one has to ask why. One has to say, how could that happen? Is it because those sophistications, those upper levels of cognition were very new? That's one answer. Or have they been traumatized? They're not as strong as we think. That's another answer, right? Is there a media out there that's run by KGB frickin' Central, to work overtime to, undermine it? Yeah, there is, right? So, I mean, it's multiple things that, and then even the situation in parenting. But when one sends parenting, don't forget, that's not just mom and dad. That becomes the club. That becomes the cult. That becomes the clique. In fact, that can become the crowd. Your next parents could be, Big Daddy or the guru or the cult leader or an idea. Mom and dad are just the first parents. We constantly seek a new home.
Where you left off before the connection cut off, you mentioned, and this is something that I definitely want to go a little bit more into, is how people, it's not just about your mother and father, people are constantly searching for a new de facto parent to kind of concede their own inner authority to. If I'm on the right page, it seems that's what you were going into. Before I stop, though, I just wanted to say this is so interesting because it aligns so much with the north and south nodes of Pluto, soul development, again, this evolutionary process. The north node, is our evolutionary direction, but if the roots of where we came from are tainted, so to speak, it's certainly going to evolve into a path that is less than optimal. And with the north node of Pluto being in Cancer, we can definitely see tribalism being a big piece where people aren't necessarily growing up, but what we're seeing is that they're looking for a mother in the crowd to kind of help keep them arrested, uh, and so that this seems to be a big thing because it's so important. From what I can tell, as someone who's gone through a lot in my life and had to really become my own parents, that we develop that for ourselves to become our own mom and our own dad rather than constantly seeking that in the outside world.
Yeah, I agree. It really does have to happen. And you're lucky if you have a good friends, if the family's rubbish, then you can at least, and again, you can move up to icons, great writers, great musicians, there is still imagos out there. And that's essential for ego growth because the ego can't starve without heroic figures, and you do have to seek them out for yourself. And that's what happens to people. If they're lucky, they'll find those. And sometimes that can do it. That can really, really be the key that helps them. But the culture that we're in right now has always been collectivistic. And when you have a government that excels at pulling the rugs, right, creating more trauma, like I said, any trauma that you experience, the government knows, or not the government, but the people who control the government, the secret government, they're aware of all this psychology, and they're aware of how if they keep on causing traumas, then, and Pluto has a lot to do with this, because Pluto's both the surreptitious like Pisces is, like Neptune is, the unseen forces of power, but it's also the power to fight against it. It's a dual thing, of course. Without Pluto, you won't have a chance of fighting it. So, but the one equation that always should never be forgotten is that all trauma of a social and domestic level, or form, will awaken the deeper reservoirs of trauma underneath. And that's how you understand modern times. It's one of the key things. So it's not that then certain mothers or fathers are to blame necessarily. They could be pig ignorant. They may not know anything what they're doing. They just may be brutes, right? And that's their worst crime. But unfortunately, I think it would help if the victim and the perpetrator knew what's happening. If you knew that, a volcano was lying below, some of the most evil people wouldn't care less and still would continue their behavior. But a great deal of other people would suddenly realize that, hey, I need to tone down my levels of trauma or abuse, because I don't want this person to be that susceptible to something much deeper, and I can see that they might be driven to psychosis, right? In other words, it's just an interesting fact. If this was the kind of fact that was some intellectual thing, by now it would already have been plugged in. If this was something that a regular doctor discovered or whatever, some expert, we'd already probably be working with it right now. But because it's coming from left field and it's obscure to say the least, it's still not really absorbed into mainstream thought, or even as I've discovered, it's not even in alternative thought. But it's my job to try to make it at least a little bit palatable for people. But there's incredible history behind trauma alone. Just trauma alone even goes back historically, to extraordinary events that have happened in the ancient past. And the Native American Indian people talk about it. And you're quite right, as you said earlier, we still don't have the data on whether the violent, historical period was similar to a prehistorical violent period. There's scholars who think it was just as rapacious, just as brutish, prior to your Attila the Huns or Genghis Khans. And there's others who go, no, it wasn't. So I've studied this, and it's very, very difficult to tell. I'm working on stuff now that might delve into that, but right now it's impossible to tell. So because we do have stories of golden ages and Arctic homelands and paradisical. It's there. It's in our mythology. I want us to take that seriously. So could that be a time when we were trauma free? and all the rest. And one must accept that. One must also look into that. See, if you're unbiased, you accept both right ideas, that warfare and brutality and cruelty, especially cruelty towards animals and the nature, my goodness, maybe certainly ancient man couldn't have done that. If he did, he wouldn't have survived. If ancient man was as brutish towards nature as we were, then how would he learn about herbs? How would he learn about astronomy and astrology and husbandry? So obviously there's a case to be made for the ver perpetuum. I went into this in the Atlantis book, the eternal spring, and that might take many forms. It could have been a physical thing on the earth when the polar shift hadn't happened, or it could have been a mythological euphemism. All of these things are still in the air. Nobody's an expert in it, and everybody is part of the review of it and the study of it. And the Masons have their own take on this. With the paradisical garden in René Le Chateau, the Knights Templars designed temples and ley lines down there, all based in this sort of paradisical golden section, golden age. So one way or another, it's either a metaphor, some sort of alchemical metaphor that we were in a perfect state. The Christians have it too in their Genesis story. You come from a perfect state and then you had a fall. All the native tribes have it too. Whether it was a metaphor or whether it was a reality, who can say? So therefore, it really is more a case of looking into the ontogenetic existence to sort of pinpoint, in our own lives where the damage is being done, with the historical stuff as a background. With Velikovsky, Julian Jaynes, whoever. Yeah, that's a nice background. It always should be there. But if we really want to heal the world, we've got to deal with the pragmatics, of the utilitarian existence of parenting in general. And then that brings us right into the Wilhelm Reiches and the Otto Ranks and the Arthur Janovs. That's to me a focal point. So there's not just some history story, which is fascinating actually, but it's not just that. It is actually about hands-on, change in our world to stop the authoritarianism and the patriarchy or matriarchy. So the women keep pointing to patriarchy. Yeah, is that because you've got an evil matriarchy going on as well that you don't want us to look at or probe into?
If only you knew. For real though, I mean, I can really only use myself as an example in my life experience. And I have to say, you brought up a really great point. If a lot of people knew what they were doing, the impact of their actions, like really knew that, I think that most people would choose to change their actions, though not necessarily everyone. I'm certainly one of those people where, in my earlier years, I thought that who I was and what I was doing was correct. And this is just how you live in the world. And it actually literally took a psychotic break for me at a Saturn return, interestingly enough, well-timed, for me to realize, wait a second, that is not, this is not how a person is actually meant to behave. It's not about dog eat dog. It's about actually listening to your conscience, which was something that was very much buried in me. And I feel like with a lot of women, our conscience is intentionally buried. If you look at the narrative of society, we're kind of taught to become a certain thing, to fit a certain mold, and it's definitely not an ethical or conscientious way of being. And yet, where we're at, like you were saying, studying psychology is obviously going to be important, but a big piece of I feel like undoing the knots that have been tied, so to speak, as far as how we got to this point, is going to be coming from us on an individual level, really getting to know what's going on inside of us. Personally, for me, I things like meditation was huge, just to be able to go inside and watch what was happening. In our society, at least from where I'm from, with the types of issues I was dealing with, I thought I was crazy. I honestly thought I was crazy, and it took me doing a 10-day silent meditation course to watch my brain 11 hours a day in silence to realize, no, it's not the brain that's crazy. It's that we're highly confused. We're highly out of touch. And I personally feel like that's a big piece. And I notice, I guess this will be one of my wrap up thoughts that I thought maybe you could go into if you like, is we are really seeing the parallels between the damaged feminine, so to speak, and of course the subsequent damaged masculine, and the current state of society and humanity. And we can see how it relates, I feel, to a disconnection from nature and from the mother principle. You mentioned very often that it's important to go into nature, and I'm wondering if you can share that or maybe other solutions to wrap this up with that you feel could help us to bring ourselves into our potential as human beings.
Oh yeah, well, of course, we're always in nature, but we're not at the same time because of this urban sprawl, which eats up all our time. And even those who do go to nature, they're not perfect either. It's a certain way that you go to nature is key. You get all these joggers and bungee jumpers and dog walkers and all this nonsense. That's not going to nature. The hikers and all this, that's still on a very sensual level. The going to nature I'm thinking of is always in the Emersonian, way, which is to understand that nature is your mirror of the self as opposed to a mirror of the ego, and that it is your teacher. And so it's a return in a reverent way, in a holy way, in a spiritual way, completely unknown to the urbanites, the religion, and even it's always the last thing. You've had every kind of cult, you've had every kind of movement, the New Age. Now you got this New Thought movement, whatever. And none of them speak about nature, or if they do, it's in some boogaloo. It's still a decoration to your inauthentic life. Mm-hmm. When I talk about going into nature, I mean to end the inauthentic life, and everyone has to do that their own way. Because the very next question everybody asks is, well, where's the A to Z manual on it? No, that's the wrong way to go into nature. That's the wrong way to do anything in life. We're in the mess we are because of the manual and the instruction guidebook. Went into this in the podcast on Sunday. So yeah, nature is to play a part, but it's how you go in there. You must go there with an empty bowl. Then like rituals like you just spoke of, where that would be an act of centroversion. Introversion is an adequate word as well, in which you start to say, I got to watch myself. Who am I? I go back and do a soul ensouling. I ensoul myself again, to ground myself again. And centroversion for me is when you start to go back, not to just think how you think, but to feel how you feel about a particular thing. And we need to be doing that on a regular basis. So, oh yes, there is more chaos in the world. There probably will be even more of it. So what? The person who has learned about centroversion doesn't care if the things were 10 times as bad. It's only the person who's, like beads rolling around all over a table without a thread will then be the worry warts, well, look at what's happening in the headlines. Yeah, so what does it matter what's happening in the headlines? Why are you all out of sorts about it? Well, because there's no self there anymore. So, but nobody else can give you birth to the self. You have to give it yourself, to yourself. And that puts you on that's the masculine platform I was talking about. That's the true entrance to the masculine world, mm-hmm. in which nothing anybody else does, says, or think is really of that much concern to you. Certainly not to let you lose your kilter. I'm not talking about some psychopath who doesn't care, think what other people think, say, and do. No, there's another stoical approach to that, where you will not lose your own sense of selfhood. You will not you will not lose your energy. You will not lose your income or your finances, you see, over the constant histrionics of some constitutional moral inferior who's, jumping, episodically in an episodic society of the next headline. Don't you know the big brother, the puppeteers, that they want you exactly in that position? Well, see, still half the world doesn't know that. They've heard the word conspiracy theorist, and that's about it. They don't know half the content mm-hmm. of what those people have tried to say. And of course, how some of them are mad anyway, so it can lead you round and round. But nature is important, centroversion is important, and all it is the ability to check back with yourself and say, how do I really feel? I've heard what Tom, Dick, and Harry have said about this. How do I actually really feel? And if you come upon a kind of lack of concern, then you own it. And if you come upon a sadness, then you own it. And if you come upon anger, you own it. But we're not doing that anymore. Our lives have been turned inside out. There is no more centroversion. There's no introversion. There's no checking back on how I feel about a particular thing. And see, now what's happening is we're paying the price of that, because the soul has a demand. The self has a certain call upon us. And the more we neglect it, the more it will reciprocate that neglect. So all the types you're seeing running around right now, they are the ones who have betrayed the soul. To speak as the occultists do, this is the betrayal of oneself, and there'll be a price to pay for that. Whereas the person who's rooted and grounded, they don't have as much to worry them really. And also the astrological, aspects or whatever, they solidly back this up, because mm-hmm. as you well know, Uranus and Aquarius, they're the public domain. They are the screaming masses or the hordes, and the Pluto is the deep centriverting, aspect. It's like a dark light that's coming to uncover, like forensic people have that luminol or whatever that shines up the blood. Pluto is doing that. It's showing up where the crime is. And the crime could be 100 years old. It could be 100,000 years old, or it could be 1 minute old. Pluto doesn't care. It just says, where is the injustice? Because we need to do deep structural osteopathy. And it goes back to the original question, not only nature, but looking after your soma, looking after your body. Anybody who's just in the realm of intellectual ideas, no matter how beautiful those ideas may be, is still only, 20% in. And so the whole of America, even though they've had beautiful films like, American Beauty, they've been warned and warned, and they all signed off and gave Oscars, but that's all a smokescreen. That's just window dressing. Did they actually get the point of what the film said and so many other wonderful movies? No, just move right back onto the Apollonian mental intellectual stuff. And if it comes to the body, let's just go for more jogging with my Walkman.
Mm-hmm.
It's so farcical, like you said earlier. The whole thing is bizarre. They're not, but the Soma, as Wilhelm Reich, Arthur Janov, Alexander Lowen, and many others have spoken of it. That's the real return to sanity, is to awaken a sensitivity that's finally listening to the body. There is no sanity without that.
Mm-hmm. This is very, very true. And it's so, the timing of where we're at in humanity's timeline, it couldn't have been more perfect, honestly, because we've got Uranus and Taurus right now. Uranus has a lot to do with trauma, right? And dissociation as well, from an evolutionary perspective. And so with Uranus being in Taurus, it's not a happy place for it to be. And yet here we are. We need to come back into the body. Part of the individuation process is to ground into the body, regardless of the traumas that we're experiencing, to look at it objectively and rationally from a Uranian point of view, in that way where we can be objective, look at it and see, like, this is where we're at, this is what we're dealing with, and we can't go anywhere at this point. I mean, of course, it's going to be people's choice wherever they want to go. If they want to go float off out of the body and live in another realm, that's their choice. But at the end of the day, I feel like moving forward is a big piece of that, is coming back into the body, and even further, like you were saying, acknowledging what is arising rather than wanting to find distractions to forget or to numb what our body's literally trying to impart to us, so that we can come back home, essentially home to the vessel, as I would say.
Yeah, and the word unconscious is key. But
Yes.
unconscious is true, because remember, the greater damage was done in the semiotic. That is the definition of unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
People use this word, right? They have all sorts of visions of what it means. Keep with the most basic thing. Before 3 years old, that's why everybody knows that memory doesn't work. You can hardly remember anything before 3. And even before 5, most people's memory is fairly vague, even though you would now have memories. And the neuroscientists rightly say it's because language skills haven't been born yet. Your memory becomes more vivid as your language abilities, which just simply means left brain structures, are sharper. And so it's quite late in the day. Take that back 5 years. What kind of memory are you going to have, in the first year of your birth, or, something even before that? None. Only the vaguest outlines are known. So the definition for unconscious, especially for those sort of skeptical materialist people who won't even believe in an unconscious, even though they sleep and have dreams at night, yeah, you'd be amazed. Well, even, your childhood, infantile lack of memory is then your definition of unconscious. So a lot of stuff has happened there. So the things we've just spoken about, going into nature, being an artist, taking care of the body, especially that last one, what do you thing happens when you really are doing that kind of shutting down the body? You're awakening the memory, and the body has all of those memories in its cellular structure and its meridians and all of that. So part of the deep memory is to bring up. Why we don't do it is because it's wounds, right? It's in the right brain. The right brain's known to keep a memory of all the that's why these people who go into deprivation tanks and try these long-term, what are they called, these sweat lodges, often go climbing, the wall. They lose it. Yeah, not because of anything in the sweat lodge, fool. It's because you're awakening agonies within. That was the whole point of the thing. The shaman is a pure person who's already confronted his demons, right? So in short, that's what you do when you work with the body. Before you heal, certain pains, illnesses, poisons are going to arise. And that's the test. But unfortunately, most people in the world, they're not able to handle that. And that's why we remain in this, sort of a surreal social domestic bubble, right? Because to penetrate down into the real unconscious, which is not some Freudian attic or some grotto, the actual unconscious is the body, the somatic intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd rather pump it till it hurts, in this pathetic mechanical way. It's all we've mechanized the whole thing, so we don't have to hear. We blocked it out by a certain cacophony, and so our whole picture of health needs to change. You need to get into Tai Chi, Qigong, and the early stages of Aikido, or a mixture of all of those, or something you've come up with yourself. You need to find something like that will help to process this. So, and that'll cut down on the insomnia, the overeating, the bulimia, the anorexia, the breakouts, the bad eyesight, the frustrations. All of this is part of sovereignty. I'm the only one who talks about it in the whole of this movement. I mean, it's absolutely, I had greater hopes when I came in, but they were dashed quick. They don't want to know, and they don't want to know for the very reason we've just said, because, I don't want to do that. They're sure I'm away to Bible school, right? They don't want anything to do with this real holy work. And nature, well, it's just decoration for my authentic life, and all of that. So we have serious problems. But I don't care about those, because my message always goes out only to individuals who are going to put it in the sovereignty and are going to do that meditation and centrovert and get into nature a bit more, and get things more straight in their minds about their identity. But always, always, always with this theme that Dragon Mother brings up, and that is, your identity was first crushed, or at least first accosted, in semiotic levels and Oedipal, but let's just focus on the earliest period, so that you're very unconscious about it. And you have no actual conscious memories of it at all, except that might come up in nightmares, or suddenly when you hear the story of an abused person, you find yourself crying for some reason, right? Because there's the body again, trying to process it, or your favorite music or whatever. But apart from these very, very subconscious, subliminal responses, you're not really fully conscious, and we have to. And the whole human race has clearly decided not to. So there's nothing I can do about it, because with freedom, you let people be free to choose whatever they want. And that's part of the North Node as well, by the way, is not just what is there to have, it's the freedom to attain it. Mm-hmm. People forget that. They go, oh, there's the treasure trove. Yeah, but don't you have to have the freedom of will to say yes to it or no to it or in between to it, right? So unfortunately, this is the part that's missing. People are free to say, no, I know exactly what you're talking about there, mate, and don't count me out. And you have to then say, understood. And that's where I find myself in my personal life right now. Something may change it, or it may stay like that forever, but I've done what I can to put this out there, to give the guideposts of somebody who does want to go back and look at this taboo area, and all the women I know are into it. So, I'm not pessimistic on that. There are women who can't resist it, but Jesus, I've got a whole female Illuminati, group page on Facebook and other pages, and there's loads and loads of women are just going, brilliant, it's a triumph, well done, give me more. Mm-hmm. So and people like yourself. So I'm not looking at it pessimistically like that. It's just one can't really be that optimistic when they're looking at the whole works of it, because psychology has been left out. Wilhelm Reich died in a stockade, under federal arrest, and was the first man to have all his books burned. Free country, right? So yeah, there's possibilities, there's silver linings. There is the movement of these planets, which I think is good. You look at the position of Chiron, you look at the position of Pluto, they're very hopeful, actually, but at the same time, one has to stoically remind themselves constantly, this is a very private thing. How can you cure the world when this thing is still raging, say, within, causing all sorts of obstructions, so one really has to process it, and also not take it personally, just because it's about women or what. It's actually really not. But the thing is, if that's all a person can see, it's about a certain kind of woman who breeds then a certain kind of man. You would have thought that the world would have been really fascinated to delve in there, So yeah, it needs to be taken reverently and with a great deal of intelligence and in a totally unbiased way.
Yes, agreed. And as you said, there's certainly a quote unquote market for this content. It's important. And I feel as though, yeah, when we look at the precession of the cycles astrologically, it's just, I mean, of course, it has a lot to do with correspondence. It has a lot to do with what we're dealing with and where we're at. At this point in time, people have access to a lot of options to come into closer contact with who they are, to deal with whatever's going on inside of themselves, and to heal that and become stronger, more, we could say, themselves again. So it's good to know that these options are here. I can't say that I would be where I'm at this point in my life, which of course is nowhere near perfect, but it's definitely an improvement. If it wasn't for, you know, authors like yourself, researchers like yourself, and this community, we could call it a community, but not really. Because it's more like people kind of peppered throughout the world that are doing this in their own way, on their own time. But I feel like I may not have necessarily been able to come to a lot of the conclusions that I have completely on my own. And so it's, even if the whole world doesn't necessarily decide to jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, at least there are people in this world that are willing to look and go there. In evolutionary astrology, they say the percentage of people who are in this state of moving away from the status quo and individuating is that, this is a ballpark, of course, because you really can't measure this entirely, is somewhere around 20 to 25% maximum, and so I feel like, I don't know, that number could change in time, but for now, this is where we're at. And, it's for all the flaws that we experience as humans, I feel like progress is being made. And I just want to thank you very much for just doing your work. Honestly, it's been a tremendous contribution in my life. And I know for sure it's been a tremendous contribution in the lives of others to help them along the way. So thanks very much for that, Michael.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we'll wrap it up. I just want to check and make sure if people wanted to get your content online, you have a Dragon Mother page. Is that dragonmother.org?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and then you also have weekly podcasts and a lot of other amazing content on unslaved.com, yes?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
All right.
correct.
Yeah, anything else? Any other places people can find you?
Yeah. On michaeltsarion.com, there's separate articles there and free interviews. It's pretty much jam-packed with information. Try to modulate everything so it's not all cluttered. But
Mhm.
Unslaved is the podcast. That's the top drawer stuff, But there's very good articles, a little bit touching on even some of the things we've talked about. But if they really are into Dragon Mother, then just go to the dragonmother.org site and it's all there. There's 3 articles and 2 books and other content as well, because again, it's an unfolding. I thought when the books were done, that was it. But the articles were a carry on, like an appendix section, and they're very, very good. People have really got back to me on those. There's about 10 of those, and they're very comprehensive, but they're also up to date. They explain a lot of stuff that's going on right now as we speak. They're probably, in a way, they're the most current work I've done, which is just kind of, that's encouraging for myself, to not always be talking about prehistory or ancient Ireland or whatever. The psychological material is just totally contemporary as well. It's based on things that are happening right now in our world. But thanks a lot, Sarah, for having me on. I really appreciate that. We have to talk more about the astrology. Some of the things you were saying really fascinating. Didn't know anything about those things, so that would be interesting to get your insights.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to do that. I mean, it's my main vocation. I mean, at least it's a main artery of my vocation. So I'm more than happy to share
Good.
whatever I can.
Yeah.
And so I will wrap it up there. Thanks everybody for listening. And I'll be back again with more hopefully useful content. All right, everyone, keep it real.